I'm an extrovert accountant. That means when I shake your hands, I look at your feet rather than mine. I've been asked to change you into extrovert accountants. I'm really looking forward to this. In my spare time, to get excited, I look at old films. And just the other weekend, I was looking at my collection, my library, and I thought, what can I look at that was going to get me excited? And I saw it, because I've just been to the Pompeii exhibition, Ben-Hur. Charlton Heston, my hero. For those of my age group, really exciting, and he was thrown onto the Roman galleys as a slave because he fell out with his boyhood friend. And I was watching this, and I started thinking. I was watching the slaves rowing away to the beat of the drum up on the deck, and the Roman soldiers whipping the slaves as they started slacking. And I thought, this is a bit like a business. And I just drifted off, that magic word. I drifted off, and I started dreaming. And I watched the slaves starting to die and getting thrown overboard, and they brought spare slaves up from the bottom to man the oars, tie them to the oars and start working until they started running out of slaves. And there started some gaps appearing, because I thought, this is so much like a business. We've got our production line, the slaves, rowing away. We've got our supervisors and managers, the Roman soldiers, whipping them to death. And we've got our owners sitting up on the deck, holding the steering wheel, the tiller for the sailors, maybe a steering wheel, and sipping wine. And I thought, this is just so like business. But there's gaps appearing in the production line. So what would normally happen in an SME business if that happened? Because you're out at sea and you've run out of slaves. Anybody tell me what would happen? Sorry? Slow down. Well, in my dream, what happened was actually the supervisors were asked by the owners to get down there and start manning the oars. And they started rowing away until we ran out of supervisors. And we got some spare gaps appearing. What happened then? And I thought, in my small business, typical of so many small businesses, too many small businesses, the owners left the steering wheel and manned the oars. And they started rowing away. And they were rowing away. And they were fantastic. They were geeing up the team. They were leading them fantastically as they were rowing in time. They left the drumming. That was the only person who wasn't allowed to man the oars. And after a while, they thought, better check if we're on direction. So they came up and thought, oops, we've gone off direction. Change the tiller, change the direction, and get back rowing. It's not their fault. That's how they've been brought up to do it. Grandmother said, if you roll up your sleeves and do a hard day's work, you'll get a fair day's pay. So it's all about working hard. Now we know it's all about working smart, not working hard. But they were carrying on rowing. And eventually, after having luckily missed the rocks, they got into port. And they'd heard about the McKinsey maxim. What you can measure, you can manage. And so they'd gathered data and they did a review. And they thought, well, we've done really well here. We've heard Derry talking about measuring the things that matter. What we've got is fantastic recovery. We couldn't have got any more out of our production line than we did. But they realized, although they were safe, they'd got into the wrong port. And they took twice as long as they should have done getting there. So what they did is they called for Super Mike. Remember, it's my dream. Super Mike came to the rescue. Tell me the story. Tell me the story. It was originally Super Derry, but then I thought, no, let's take some of the glory. You can have an extrovert accountant occasionally. So they told me what was happening, and I realized they were confusing activity with results. So many businesses are so focused on the rowing, they forget about what they were trying to do in the first place. So I had to go back and explain to the owners, like I go back to so many businesses, and say, right, just like Derry has been saying, let's go to fundamentals. The golden rule is all about living your life on purpose and understanding it's starting with the end in mind. If you don't know where you're trying to go, as Mao Zedong said in his Long March, any road will get you there. So if you are looking for that pot of gold straight down there, and your team are distracted by the mountains like Derry gets distracted, they're going to go off direction. There's got to be clarity. And you've got to be able to measure and put along the way milestones to measure your progress. So strategy is the plan to achieve the ultimate objective. In our picture, that sun or the pot of gold at the end. In Derry's, it's the top of that mountain. But wherever it is, you've got a clear strategy of your ultimate goal, and you've got to put milestones in the way to measure your progress. And you might change, as Derry was saying earlier, things might change along the way, but you have to have a way of measuring the progress. So if you know, do your team know? Because what I find in business is quite often the owners know what they're trying to do, but actually haven't shared it with their team. And they don't understand, their team don't understand the impact that they will have on the ultimate goals of the business. They don't understand the position they play. And I've always reminded, it's a very old story, but I think it's worth repeating, going back to 1963, before he was assassinated, when John Kennedy visited Cape Canaveral. And he spoke to the two cleaners, and the cleaners were asked what they do. And one cleaner said, well, I'm a cleaner, Mr. President. A bit later on in his walk around, he asked the other cleaner, what do you do? He said, Mr. President, I'm helping put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. That's the difference between the person who knew. It's an old story, but I love it. It sums it up. So many businesses, people do not know where they stand and what they're trying to do and what the ultimate objective, because that cleaner knew. However menial he might think his job is, if there was dirt in the electronics, that rocket would not be able to reach the moon. And so what I'm saying is, if you know what you're going to have to measure, it can be all sorts of different measures. And there's all sorts of traditional measures that we're going to come on to. So without boring you, I want you to think about the measures that you would think are important to your business. Anybody tell me what's the most important in your mind? Key results. Simon?
Cash flow.
Cash flow? Cash. Profit? Anybody else? Guy, you're obviously part of Derry's crowd. We'll get to there. We'll get there. Let me give you some examples. This is what traditionally some businesses are looking to measure. They'll be looking at your sales revenue, your market share, your cash. It is so important. As Derry said, if people run out of cash, it's the end of the business, and they're not looking at the return on capital is so important. You invest so much money. I see so many owners going without money themselves. The first people should be paid in any business are the owners, because unless they're paying themselves, they're asking the wrong questions. Because quite often they'll go without and they'll fudge the factor, because what they're doing is allowing the business to continue when it can't actually afford to pay them, and they're the ones taking the risk. So the return on investment, the return on capital invested is so important. The profits are important, the number of customers. we're going to go all into this. But these are absolutes. And it's a mistake we made. And Derry actually referred to it earlier. One of the things we need to look at is turn absolutes into ratios. Because ratios actually create trends. Because an absolute in one business is going to be completely different to an absolute in another business. And a number of people say to me, how do you think I've done? Because their profits have increased by 10%. And I said, I don't know. What were you planning to do? Because if you were planning to do 50% and you've only done 10%, it's been a bit disappointing. But if you thought you were going to make a loss and you've made a 10% profit, fantastic. Everything is relative to what your original plan was. So what I would suggest to you is we always look in terms of relative ratios. So let's break down the components and look at sales. I'm looking at Steve Clark there, ready, jumping out to tell me some ideas. What are the key sales drivers you would measure in any business? You see, I haven't talked about profit and loss account yet. Sales pipeline, okay. Anybody else? Sales this quarter, yes. So historical, yeah. Cost of sale. Average order value. Right, excellent. You can tell this is an enlightened group. Let's just break this down. So key drivers of sales, the number of customers. This is basing it down to simple things we can get a lot more complicated. How often they buy and how much they spend. And if we actually break that down, the number of customers, it's the lead generation. It's the product of the lead generation, how good we are at converting those leads, and how good we are at stopping the customers leaving at the bottom end. How often they buy, and then how much they spend, is a concept of the price you charge and the quantity they buy, and the value of your proposition. Now, very few businesses, despite understanding that, actually measure the components of sales. What they do is they measure the number of customers and how much they spend, absolutes. If you want to make decisions about where you're going and what you can change at the right time, and we'll come on to, as Derry was calling it, what I call leading indicators and lagging indicators, we'll come on to that at the end, you've got to be able to measure the components to be able to make a decision at the right time to make a change if it's not working. So as Andy is saying about the sales pipeline, we've got the lead generation, lead conversion. We need to know if we're not getting them into the pipeline, we need to know what we're expecting to come through before we even talk about what's being converted. So we've got to measure the components. Now, that's only if it matters when it comes to the ultimate goal. Because remember, what we're trying to do is measure what matters in relation to our ultimate goal. So let's break down to the cost. Because we tend to focus on sales. What about cost and cash? What would we measure when it comes to cost and cash? What costs are important? Direct costs. Yeah? Overheads. Running costs. Okay. So I'm keeping this simple because I said to you, I had this goal to turn you into extrovert accountants like myself. Direct costs. Again, we don't break this down. This is so, so, so important. The number of times I see a profit expressed to me in the wrong terms when we should be talking in terms of contribution. People talk to me in terms of gross profit, and I said, it's not a profit until your profit exceeds your overheads. Until then, it's a contribution towards your overheads. And we've got to know what your direct costs are and how they are affected by your activity. So in other words, your cost of sales, the quantity purchased compared to the unit cost of goods sold. And if you need to drop your prices, that's okay, as long as you can drop your costs, because it's all about making profit. But very few people measure the components of costs, let alone the components of sales. So my challenge is, what's important to you? We are all faced, nobody wants to pay any more than they need to. But have you got your contribution analysis broken down. Your activity costs are the activities that are affected by your sales. Things like motor expenses, transport, telephone, tweety stuff, as Derek calls it, your social media. You might be paying pay-per-click. I've got lots of clicks coming onto my internet, so great, but are you getting lots of sales? So what are your activity costs in comparison to the sales that you're doing? And what are your fixed costs? You can't do anything about your fixed costs. You know, your rent is your rent is your rent. Your wages are your wages are your wages, unless they're on an hourly rate compared to the activity you're doing. You need to be able to break it down, because I find that so many businesses do not understand, too many businesses do not understand the analysis. And they look at the profit at the bottom, and they're not breaking down the things they can actually influence. So if we were trying to put that into ratios, in Derry's book, I took the precaution of reading the book, and Derry was talking about various ratios that matter to him. Now, every business is going to have different ratios that matter in terms of cost. If I was going to go into a hotel or care home, I've got different ratios that matter to someone in the service industry. So we've got to find what matters to us. So if we're in a marketing business, we need to know what our costs per lead are, what it's costing us, what are the cost drivers, what is our reliability, what is our remake ratio, what's our overhead. So if I was looking at a care home, I'd be wanting to know per bed. A hotel, I want to know per bed. A hotel, I want to know what's my food costs per people coming in. My cash drivers are the things like my debtors coming in, the people who owe me money, and how long am I taking to pay back the people I owe? What can I do to generate cash? Stock turnaround. How quickly, how little stock do I hold, or is my stock I'm holding to service my sales too much? All a relation, all a factor of my costs and my income. And there's so many areas that can go wrong. Another cost that, unfortunately, unless you are in sophisticated software, very rarely gets measured, is what I call profit robbers. They're examples of waste. We all have them. Poor marketing, poor team morale, poor customer satisfaction. Think of a hotel. TripAdvisor. I was speaking at the Cornwall tourism conference last year, and they were beating me up because I was saying, just face it, TripAdvisor is here to say, embrace it, go with it, and use it. And I was telling them a story about, I went to this little hotel in Paris, and on the desk there said, our TripAdvisor score today is 4.6. If you do not feel able to give us a 5 out of 5, please tell us immediately why, so that we can rectify the problem. They wore their TripAdvisor on their sleeve. And what they were saying is making a statement, we will not let you down. And one of their key performance indicators, their BGIs, was their customer satisfaction rating, as it showed on TripAdvisor, because it was there for the whole world. And as Peter was saying earlier, it's what other people are talking about. Your TripAdvisor, that's what we're all going to be faced with. There's going to be a TripAdvisor for all our businesses in due course. They're all functions that we have got to measure. They're all costs. And if we don't measure them and we don't pay attention, they're going to be areas of waste, money that we're wasting. They're all examples that we can do. Our team need to understand this. We need to decide which of these, and there's so many more, that matter to our business to help us achieve our goals. So do you have any profit robbers in your business that you're not measuring because it's not in your financial accounts package, which measures absolutes, but very rarely measures ratios or qualitative factors like this? Now, one other factor. Again, your underlying success driver. This is more strategic, but is also tactical. What are the underlying success drivers that are important? Now, that's different, again, for every business. Let me give you some examples. Continental, I don't know if any of you have read this book by Gordon Bethune. He was the chief executive who worked for Boeing and went to Continental Airlines, who were always last. They were 9th out of 9, and very proudly, as he talks about, they became 10th out of 10th in terms of the worst performing airlines in the United States. And he turned them round from worst to first. The book, something I can recommend you look at. What did he do? What did he measure? What were the things that matter? Everybody said, you're mad. Underlying success factors in an airline. Anybody hazard a guess? Passenger satisfaction, ETAs. On-time arrival, lost luggage. One of the key areas that were so important. Other examples. Team potential. Innovation and creativity. How do you measure that? It matters. The investment. We heard Derry talking about getting people on board, hunting talent. The investment in knowledge. The investment in your systems, in your operations. Customer delight. And I've just added in there moments of truth, because thinking about Continental Airlines brought me back. Peter was talking about the 1% difference on the track cycling team. I remember this story about Scandinavian Airlines, where Jan Carlsen talked about moments of truth. And he was the guy who said, if somebody came onto my plane and pulled down the meal flap and said, there's a coffee stain, gosh, what must be the state of my engines? No relation, of course, but he said, every moment of contact with a customer is a moment of truth. And if I can get every moment of contact a 1% improvement, it makes a massive difference. So these are areas, what are the 1% that matter? What are the moments of truth in your business? What are the moments of contact with your customers that you are failing to measure? Not just the absolutes. Unlike this airline that Jeff and I flew in Iran, who shall be nameless, but we got on, and I found a meal tray would have been nice to have. My lap did in the circumstances, but even worse, and I turned left, and I found the emergency exit had already been used. So I suspect it came from Bulgaria or somewhere like that, so it was obviously a used plane. So it's just interesting. The moment of truth there was we breathed in and just prayed. So it's just interesting. So Derry's got his BGI one-page system. I use a similar one-page plan, borrowed from a network that we belong to get our business going. And it's borrowed a bit like the balanced scorecard. I borrow it from AVN, the accountants. And we measure the key underlying success drivers, which measure the key sales drivers, the key cost and cash drivers, ultimately the key results. And what these ones here, the underlying success drivers, are going to affect our results in the end. The results at the end have happened in the past, as Derry was explaining earlier. And this is how we measure. And this is an example of how it looks. Anybody who wants a copy of that, just email me. I'll actually give you this, let you have the system so you can use it to put into Derry's one-page plan. So I realized that the owners had not been measuring with their intent. They didn't have a clearly understood vision and goals. They hadn't set the targets. And they trusted themselves to the currents of life, just like this little duck that trot on the river with the currents of the river, and there were nice little calm areas. But equally, just to the left, there's a slightly more turbulent area. And going into rapids, really exciting, fast cars, big houses, nice holidays, and big borrowing. And of course, unless you've got control mechanisms in place, unless you've got indicators to say whether you're out of control, the danger is you could plummet into the abyss. In this case, Victoria Falls. What I call the Zambezi factor. What I call businesses who are adrenaline junkies, trusting themselves to the fortunes of life. Where the currents take me, I'll be happy. I myself prefer to have a steering wheel. I prefer to have some brakes. I prefer not to hope that just on the off chance, there might be a superhero there to protect me. It just shows who says dreams can't come true. So my challenge to you is think about your business. Think about the message that Derry has been sharing with us. What we're trying to do today is pull all these factors that matter. That was a quick race through. The last thing I wanted to do was go through a profit and loss account. But every business is different. Every business is going to have an underlying success factor, and every business is going to have sales factors that are different to other businesses. You have to decide what is most important to you, and just like in my one-page plan that I use, and just like in Derry's one-page plan, you've got to measure the things that matter that are going to help you get to your desired result. I hope in this quick run-through, I've turned you into an extrovert accountant and you've found a few tips that will help you get there. Thanks very much.